Sometimes the quietest voice in the room becomes the one no one can escape. The federal courtroom in downtown Seoul had witnessed politicians fall, billionaires beg for mercy, and men in expensive suits leave in handcuffs while cameras flashed like lightning across marble walls, but on that cold November morning, nothing prepared them for the little girl standing alone near the back row clutching a faded pink backpack against her chest. Outside, reporters crowded behind barricades stretching nearly half a block down the street, their microphones raised toward the courthouse steps where black SUVs had arrived one after another beneath gray skies heavy with rain. Every major news station in South Korea carried the trial live. Some called it the trial of the decade. Others called it the final fall of Kang Min-jae, the man newspapers nicknamed the Ghost of Busan. Even now, seated behind reinforced glass in a charcoal suit perfectly pressed despite the circumstances, Min-jae looked less like a criminal and more like someone carved from stone. His dark hair was combed neatly back. His silver watch caught the courtroom lights each time he folded his hands across the table. Two federal officers stood nearby, tense and alert, but Min-jae himself barely moved. He simply watched the room with calm, unreadable eyes while whispers drifted through the gallery like smoke. People feared him even in silence. Especially in silence. "Defendant will rise," the judge ordered. Chairs shifted softly across polished wood floors as everyone stood except the little girl in the back. She remained frozen near the aisle, her tiny sneakers damp from rainwater, her oversized navy coat slipping slightly from one shoulder. She could not have been older than 8. Most people barely noticed her at first. Why would they? In a room filled with prosecutors, armed security, television crews, and one of the most infamous crime figures in the country, a child looked invisible. But then Kang Min-jae turned his head slightly. And saw her. Something about the child's face made his expression tighten almost invisibly before returning to its usual stillness. The judge began reading formal statements. While camera shutters clicked rapidly from the media section. Prosecutors arranged stacks of documents across their tables. Somewhere near the front row, a woman quietly sobbed into a tissue. Yet the little girl never looked away from Min-jae. Her small fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack as if gathering courage from it. One of the court officers approached her gently. "Sweetheart, you need to sit with your guardian." She nodded faintly but didn't move. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges like it had been opened many times before. The officer frowned. "What is that?" The girl swallowed hard. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "My daddy told me to give this to him if something bad happened." A few nearby reporters lowered their cameras. The officer hesitated, uncertain. Then Min-jae spoke for the first time that morning, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the courtroom noise. "Bring her here." The room went still. Completely still. Even the judge stopped turning pages. The little girl stepped forward slowly, her shoes making soft squeaks against the polished floor while every pair of eyes followed her across the courtroom. Kang Min-jae watched her approach without blinking. And for the first time in years, the most feared man in Korea looked nervous. No one in the courtroom understood why Kang Min-jae suddenly looked like a man struggling to breathe. The little girl stopped only a few feet from the defense table, her tiny hands holding the folded note so carefully it seemed more precious than anything else in the world. Up close, she looked even smaller beneath the cold fluorescent lights. Her dark curls were slightly tangled from the rain outside, and the sleeves of her coat hung past her wrists as though it belonged to someone older. One of the federal officers reached for the paper automatically, but Min-jae lifted his hand without taking his eyes off the child. "No," he said quietly. "Let her give it to me." The officer froze immediately. Even now, even seated in a courtroom surrounded by armed security and prosecutors eager to destroy him, Min-jae's voice still carried the kind of authority people obeyed without thinking. The girl stepped closer. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor until she stood directly beside him. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Camera lenses shifted toward the strange moment unfolding before them. Somewhere near the back row, someone whispered the child's name. Hannah Brooks. Min-jae looked at her for a long second before finally lowering his gaze to the folded note in her hand. His fingers paused just before touching it. They were steady hands, hands that newspapers once described as incapable of hesitation, but now the movement slowed almost imperceptibly, as though he already feared what waited inside that paper. Hannah's voice trembled slightly when she spoke. "My daddy said you would understand." The courtroom remained silent. No typing. No whispering. Even the reporters had stopped moving. Min-jae carefully unfolded the note. The paper was old, creased heavily at the corners like it had traveled everywhere with her for a very long time. The handwriting across the center was uneven but unmistakably deliberate. Only one sentence. 3 words nearly shattered the man reading them. "Please protect Hannah." Min-jae stared at the note without blinking. For several seconds, nothing in the room existed except the paper in his hands and the child standing beside him. Then something changed in his face. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. Older. The kind of pain a person spends years burying so completely they almost forget it exists until one sentence tears the ground open beneath them. Assistant District Attorney Lee Sun-woo stood abruptly from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. The child should be removed immediately." But the judge did not answer right away. Because he was watching Min-jae too. Everyone was. The ghost of Busan suddenly looked less like a criminal mastermind and more like a man carrying something unbearably heavy. Hannah shifted nervously beside him. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered. Min-jae looked up at her slowly. Those cold, unreadable eyes that had terrified businessmen, politicians, and rival syndicates for nearly 2 decades softened in a way no one in the courtroom had ever seen before. "No," he said quietly. "You did nothing wrong." Hannah swallowed hard before asking the question that made several people in the gallery lower their heads immediately. "Did my daddy know you?" Min-jae's jaw tightened. Outside the courthouse windows, rain struck the glass in soft waves while distant thunder rolled across the city skyline. He looked back down at the note once more, his thumb brushing the worn crease across the middle. Then, for the first time since the trial began, Kang Min-jae stopped looking like a man planning how to survive. He looked like a man remembering someone he failed. The rain outside grew heavier as the courtroom struggled to recover from the strange stillness that had settled over everyone inside. Assistant District Attorney Lee Sun-woo adjusted his glasses sharply and cleared his throat, trying to pull attention back toward the prosecution table, but the atmosphere had already shifted. Something invisible had entered the room the moment Hannah Brooks handed that note to Kang Min-jae, and now even the seasoned reporters sitting near the front row could feel it. They had spent years writing stories about the ghost of Busan. Ruthless. Untouchable. Emotionless. Those were the words always attached to his name. Yet the man seated behind reinforced glass no longer resembled the cold figure printed across headlines for the last 15 years. He still sat perfectly straight in his tailored charcoal suit, but his eyes had changed. They no longer scanned the room like a predator measuring danger. They remained fixed on the small child standing beside him. Hannah shifted nervously beneath the attention of dozens of strangers. She held her pink backpack tightly against her chest while court officers exchanged uncertain looks nearby. Finally, an older woman hurried through the side entrance of the courtroom, her breathing uneven from climbing the courthouse stairs too quickly. "Hannah," she whispered urgently. "There you are." The child turned immediately. "Mrs. Peterson." The woman crossed the aisle quickly and knelt beside her, brushing rainwater gently from Hannah's coat sleeve. Eleanor Peterson had been Hannah's foster coordinator for nearly 6 months, though the exhaustion beneath her eyes suggested the responsibility weighed far heavier than her job title implied. She looked apologetically toward the judge. "I am so sorry, Your Honor." She slipped away from the waiting room downstairs. But the judge barely acknowledged her. His attention remained on Min-jae, whose fingers still rested against the folded note as though letting go of it might break something fragile inside him. Eleanor gently touched Hannah's shoulder. Sweetheart, we talked about this. You cannot approach defendants during federal trials. Hannah lowered her eyes. I just needed to give him the note. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated after noticing Min-jae watching the child with unsettling focus. Most people avoided eye contact with him. Eleanor had spent enough time around law enforcement to recognize dangerous men when she saw them, and everything about Kang Min-jae should have terrified her. The expensive suit. The emotionless posture. The silence. But somehow, the way he looked at Hannah now frightened her less than the sadness behind it. Your Honor, Prosecutor Lee interrupted firmly, this entire situation is becoming inappropriate. The defendant is accused of organized criminal activity spanning over a decade. This courtroom cannot turn into some emotional spectacle. Min-jae slowly lifted his gaze toward him. The room quieted again instantly. Even after months in custody, even surrounded by armed officers, his presence still controlled the air itself. Then continue, Min-jae said calmly. You wanted your spectacle. Lee stiffened visibly before turning toward the jury box. As the court already knows, the defendant operated through intimidation, corruption, and fear. Witnesses disappeared. Businesses collapsed under pressure. Entire neighborhoods remained silent because they feared retaliation. While the prosecutor spoke, Hannah glanced quietly toward Min-jae again. My daddy was never scared of you, she whispered softly. The words were so quiet most people missed them. But Min-jae heard every syllable. His jaw tightened slightly. Eleanor looked startled. Hannah, she murmured carefully, you knew this man before today? The child nodded once. Daddy used to talk about him sometimes. A faint ripple moved through the gallery. Reporters exchanged quick glances and immediately began scribbling notes again. Min-jae's expression darkened, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Regret. And somewhere deep beneath the polished calm he wore like armor, an old memory had already begun waking up. The memory came back slowly at first, like fog rising from dark water. Kang Min-jae sat motionless behind the defense table while the prosecutor continued speaking to the jury, but the words around him had already begun fading into distant noise. Somewhere beyond the courthouse windows, sirens echoed through rain-covered streets, and for the first time in years, Min-jae found himself dragged backward into a past he had spent an entire lifetime trying to bury. 8 years earlier, before politicians publicly condemned him and before newspapers turned his name into something people whispered with fear, Min-jae had walked into a small noodle shop on the edge of Busan Harbor during the middle of a winter storm. The place had been nearly empty except for one man sitting near the back corner beside the window. Daniel Brooks. At the time, Min-jae did not know the man was an undercover federal investigator. He only noticed the exhausted father trying to help a little girl color quietly inside a children's activity book while steam rose from untouched bowls of soup between them. Hannah had been smaller then, no older than 3 or 4, swinging her tiny sneakers beneath the booth while crayons rolled across the table every few minutes. Min-jae remembered her laughter first. Bright. Innocent. Completely out of place in a world like his. He had entered the restaurant with 2 associates following behind him in dark coats, the kind of entrance that usually emptied rooms of conversation immediately. And it had. Customers lowered their heads. Staff members avoided eye contact. Fear always arrived before him. But not the child. Hannah looked directly at him while holding up a broken yellow crayon. Do you know how to fix this? She had asked. The entire restaurant froze. One of Min-jae's men instinctively stepped forward to pull the child away, but Daniel calmly placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Hannah, he warned softly. Yet Min-jae stopped the bodyguard with one glance. He still did not fully understand why. Maybe it was because the child showed no fear at all. Or maybe it was because she reminded him too much of someone he once lost long ago. Min-jae took the crayon carefully from Hannah's small fingers and studied the snapped wax piece in silence before reaching into his coat pocket. Slowly, he removed a silver fountain pen. Expensive. Imported from Italy. One of his men had given it to him years earlier after a successful negotiation. Min-jae twisted the pen apart and handed Hannah the tiny gold cap. "Use this instead," he said quietly. The little girl's face lit up instantly like sunrise after rain. Daniel watched the exchange carefully. Not frightened. Observing. Measuring. There had been intelligence in his eyes even then, the kind carried by men who saw more than they admitted. "Thank you," Daniel said politely after Hannah returned to coloring. Min-jae nodded once before turning to leave, but Daniel spoke again before he reached the door. "You know," he said calmly, "children usually know who people really are before adults do." Min-jae paused slightly at the doorway. He remembered the cold wind pushing rain through the entrance behind him while the restaurant lights reflected against wet pavement outside. "And what does your daughter think I am?" he asked without turning around. Daniel looked toward Hannah, who remained focused on coloring crooked yellow stars across the paper. Then he answered quietly, "Someone lonely." Back in the courtroom, Min-jae blinked slowly as the old memory settled heavily inside him. Across the room, Hannah sat beside Eleanor Peterson now, her small hands folded neatly in her lap while she watched him with the same unafraid eyes she had as a child. And suddenly, for the first time since his arrest, Kang Min-jae understood why seeing her again felt less like punishment and more like judgment. The prosecutor resumed speaking, but the courtroom no longer belonged to him. People still listened, jurors still faced forward, reporters still scribbled notes across legal pads, yet the energy inside the room had shifted somewhere beyond procedure and evidence. It lingered around the child sitting quietly beside Eleanor Peterson and the man who could not stop looking at her. Kang Min-jae had spent most of his adult life mastering control. Control over fear. Control over people. Control over himself. That discipline had built an empire powerful enough to make politicians whisper behind closed doors and wealthy businessmen change their tone the moment his name entered conversation. But now a little girl with damp sneakers and a faded backpack had unsettled him more completely than federal prosecutors ever could. Prosecutor Lee paced slowly before the jury box, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The defendant cultivated an image of discipline and sophistication, he said firmly, but beneath that image existed an organization built on intimidation and silence. A large monitor flickered to life beside the prosecution table, displaying financial records, photographs of luxury properties, and years of investigative reports. Jurors studied the screen carefully while camera crews adjusted focus from the media section. Min-jae barely glanced at any of it. His attention remained fixed on the silver fountain pen now resting beside Hannah's backpack. Eleanor had removed it gently after discovering the child still carried it everywhere. The same pen Min-jae had given her years ago in that tiny noodle shop near Busan Harbor. Hannah noticed him staring at it. She picked it up carefully with both hands. "Daddy said it was special," she whispered. Min-jae's expression tightened almost invisibly. "He kept it?" Hannah nodded. "He said good people leave proof behind." Eleanor looked between them uneasily. The quiet familiarity in their conversation no longer felt accidental. Around them, even court officers had begun listening more closely. "Miss Peterson," Min-jae asked calmly without looking away from Hannah, "how long has she been in foster care?" Eleanor hesitated. She clearly had not expected the question. "About 6 months. No relatives?" "An elderly grandfather in Oregon, but his health is declining. The state has been reviewing options." Hannah lowered her eyes toward the floor. "Nobody wants older kids," she said softly. The simple sentence landed harder than any testimony presented that morning. Eleanor immediately wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, but the damage was already done. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman near the front row quietly removed her glasses to wipe her eyes. Min-jae remained perfectly still. Yet something behind his expression seemed to crack deeper with every word the child spoke. Prosecutor Lee noticed the atmosphere slipping away from him again and stepped forward sharply. "Your Honor, the court cannot allow this emotional distraction to continue. The defendant is manipulating sympathy." Min-jae finally looked toward him. Calm. Cold. But no longer detached. You think this is sympathy? He asked quietly. The prosecutor straightened. I think criminals often hide behind sentiment when facts corner them. A faint silence followed. Then Hannah spoke before anyone else could. My daddy said people only act mean when they are scared. Several reporters stopped writing at once. Prosecutor Lee blinked in visible irritation while Hannah looked down at her lap, apparently unaware she had just silenced an entire federal courtroom again. Min-jae stared at the child for a long moment before something unexpected touched his face. Not a smile exactly. Something sadder. Softer. Almost human. Outside, rainwater streaked down the courthouse windows while distant thunder rolled across Seoul like a warning carried through the sky. And somewhere deep inside Kang Min-jae, an old promise he failed to keep was beginning to feel heavier than the charges waiting to destroy him. By early afternoon the rain had turned the courthouse windows into blurred sheets of gray, muting the skyline beyond downtown Seoul until the entire city looked distant and ghost-like. Inside Courtroom 7, however, every detail felt painfully sharp. The scratching of pens. The hum of television equipment. The quiet rustle of expensive suits shifting across leather chairs. And at the center of it all sat Kang Min-jae beside a folded note that seemed heavier than the dozens of legal documents stacked around him. Hannah Brooks had stopped speaking for several minutes now. She sat quietly beside Eleanor Peterson with her backpack resting against her knees, occasionally twisting the loose sleeve of her oversized coat around her fingers when nervous thoughts crept into her mind. Yet somehow her silence carried more weight than the prosecutor's entire presentation. Assistant District Attorney Lee Sun-woo pressed forward aggressively, sensing the trial slipping beyond his control. The court will now review testimony connected to Daniel Brooks, he announced while signaling toward the monitor near the jury box. Hannah looked up immediately at the sound of her father's name. Min-jae's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. A photograph appeared on the screen. Daniel Brooks stood outside a small community center wearing jeans and a dark wool coat, smiling softly while holding a much younger Hannah in his arms. Snow covered the sidewalks around them. Hannah's tiny pink boots looked almost too large for her feet. The image lasted only seconds before legal documents replaced it, but the damage had already been done. The room no longer saw Daniel Brooks as evidence. They saw a father. Daniel Brooks disappeared 18 months ago while assisting an ongoing federal investigation, Prosecutor Lee continued firmly. His connection to the defendant remains one of the central questions before this court. Eleanor gently placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder as the child stared silently at the screen. Did they ever find my daddy? She asked quietly. Nobody answered right away. The hesitation itself became an answer. Hannah lowered her head slowly. Min-jae watched her from across the room with an expression so unreadable it unsettled even the officers standing beside him. Then the prosecutor delivered the sentence he believed would finally regain control of the courtroom. Evidence strongly suggests Daniel Brooks died because he became involved with dangerous people. The silence afterward felt immediate and heavy. Hannah looked toward Min-jae again. Not with fear. Not even with anger. Just confusion. My daddy said you were not dangerous, she whispered softly. Several jurors glanced toward Min-jae at once. Prosecutor Lee exhaled sharply in frustration. Children do not understand these situations, he said coldly. They only see what adults allow them to see. Hannah frowned slightly, thinking carefully before speaking again. Then why do adults lie so much? The question landed harder than anyone expected. A court reporter actually paused typing mid-sentence. One juror covered his mouth with his hand while another stared down at the table as though suddenly uncomfortable with everything happening inside the room. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, exhausted by the impossible honesty children carried without realizing it. Min-jae slowly leaned back in his chair. His gaze remained fixed on Hannah while distant thunder rolled faintly beyond the courthouse walls. Then, after a long silence, he finally spoke again. Your father was a good man. Every camera in the room immediately turned toward him. Prosecutor Lee straightened sharply. Defendant will refrain from unauthorized statements. But Min-jae ignored him completely. Hannah's eyes widened slightly. You knew him really well? Min-jae looked down briefly at the folded note in his hand before answering. Better than I should have. The room fell quiet once more. Not courtroom quiet. Something deeper. The kind of silence that arrives when people realize the story they believed may not be the truth at all. The air inside courtroom 7 felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were listening. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall courthouse windows while Assistant District Attorney Lee Sun-woo struggled to regain authority over a room that no longer responded the way he expected. Every attempt to pull attention back toward charts, timelines, and legal arguments collapsed the moment Hannah Brooks spoke. And somehow the person most unsettled by it was no longer the jury. It was Kang Min-jae himself. He sat perfectly still beneath the cold courtroom lights, his silver handcuffs resting untouched against the polished wood table while memories he had buried years ago continued surfacing one after another. Daniel Brooks had never feared him. That truth alone made him dangerous. Most people approached Min-jae with either greed or terror. Daniel had approached him with questions. Real questions. Questions no one else dared ask. The memory returned sharply now. 6 years earlier in a quiet tea house overlooking the Han River, Daniel sat across from Min-jae wearing an ordinary gray coat and the same calm expression he carried everywhere. Outside, snow drifted slowly across the water while soft jazz played through old ceiling speakers. Min-jae remembered studying the American investigator carefully that night, already aware federal agencies suspected Daniel of getting too close to people he should have been exposing. You could still leave this world behind, Daniel had said quietly while pouring tea into 2 small porcelain cups. Min-jae almost laughed at the idea. Men like me do not retire. Daniel looked out the frosted window thoughtfully. That is not what I mean. Silence settled between them while steam rose gently from the tea. Then Daniel reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph. Hannah sat on his shoulders beneath bright summer sunlight, laughing so hard her tiny eyes nearly disappeared. Her mother passed away when she was 4, Daniel said softly. Ever since then, she keeps asking me if bad people are born bad or if they become that way later. Min-jae stared at the photograph longer than he intended. And what do you tell her? Daniel smiled faintly. I tell her people become whatever the world rewards them for becoming. Back in the courtroom, Min-jae slowly closed his eyes for half a second as the memory tightened painfully inside him. Across the room, Hannah sat quietly swinging her feet beneath the oversized courtroom chair, completely unaware she had become the center of a truth larger than the trial itself. Prosecutor Lee stepped forward again, visibly frustrated by the emotional direction things had taken. The defendant would like this court to believe he shared some noble friendship with Daniel Brooks, he said sharply. But evidence shows Brooks disappeared while investigating organized financial operations connected directly to the defendant's network. Min-jae opened his eyes again. Calm returned to his face instantly, but something colder moved beneath it now. Not anger. Resolve. You keep saying disappeared, he said quietly. Because you never found him. The prosecutor stiffened. What exactly are you implying? Before Min-jae could answer, Hannah spoke again in her small careful voice. Daddy told me something before he left. The room immediately fell silent. Eleanor Peterson gently squeezed Hannah's hand, but even she leaned closer to listen. Hannah looked toward Min-jae. He said if anything happened, I should find the man who still remembers how to feel sad. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then slowly, almost painfully slowly, Kang Min-jae lowered his head. Not to the prosecutor. Not to the judge. To the child. And for the first time since cameras captured his arrest months earlier, the ghost of Busan looked like a man carrying more shame than fear. For nearly 10 full seconds after Hannah spoke, nobody inside courtroom 7 moved at all. The silence spread slowly through the room like cold water filling every empty space. Even the storm outside seemed quieter now, the rain against the courthouse windows fading beneath the weight of what the child had just said. Kong Min-jae remained seated with his head lowered slightly, his hands folded near the note Daniel Brooks had written before disappearing. To most people watching, he still looked composed. But those closest to him noticed small changes impossible to fake. The tightness in his jaw. The way his thumb pressed repeatedly against the edge of the paper. The faint exhaustion settling behind eyes once described as emotionless. Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo recovered first. "Your Honor," he said sharply, forcing movement back into the frozen room, "this testimony is irrelevant and emotionally manipulative." Judge Han studied him carefully before responding. "The child has not provided testimony. She has simply spoken." Lee straightened stiffly. "And the defendant is clearly using the situation to influence the jury." Min-jae slowly lifted his gaze toward the prosecutor. "You give me too much credit," he said quietly. "I did not know she would be here." Hannah looked confused by the tension surrounding her. She leaned slightly toward Eleanor Peterson and whispered, "Why is everyone angry?" Eleanor brushed a loose curl gently from the child's forehead before answering softly, "Sometimes adults get uncomfortable when feelings interrupt their plans." Hannah seemed to think about that very seriously. Then she looked toward the jury box. "My daddy said plans are not the same thing as truth." Another silence followed immediately. One juror actually let out a slow breath through his nose as if trying not to react emotionally. Reporters continued writing rapidly now, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. This was no longer unfolding like an ordinary criminal trial. The story they expected was beginning to fracture in public. Judge Han adjusted his glasses and looked directly toward Min-jae. "Defendant," he said carefully, "did you know Daniel Brooks was cooperating with federal authorities?" The question hung heavily over the courtroom. Prosecutor Lee immediately objected, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Min-jae leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time all day, he looked tired instead of dangerous. "Yes," he answered calmly. A ripple moved through the gallery. Several cameras shifted closer instantly. Lee stepped forward. "And yet you maintained contact with him?" "Yes." "Why?" Min-jae's eyes drifted briefly toward Hannah before returning to the judge. "Because Daniel Brooks was one of the few men who still believed people could change." The prosecutor laughed softly in disbelief. "And did you?" Another pause. "Long enough to matter." "I wanted to." Hannah lowered her eyes quietly after hearing that answer. She seemed sad suddenly, though she probably did not fully understand why. Min-jae noticed immediately. "Your father believed kindness was a responsibility," he said softly toward her. "Even when it was inconvenient." Hannah nodded faintly. "He used to make pancakes for the neighbors when they were sick." The simplicity of the statement hit the courtroom harder than another hour of legal arguments could have. A man accused of running one of the most feared criminal organizations in Korea sat listening to a little girl describe pancakes and kindness while rain rolled down courthouse windows behind them. Nothing about the moment made sense anymore. Prosecutor Lee looked increasingly frustrated as control slipped further from his hands. "Your Honor," he pressed firmly, "the court cannot ignore reality simply because the defendant appears sentimental today." Judge Han looked toward Min-jae carefully. "Reality," the judge said quietly, "may be exactly what this courtroom is finally beginning to see." And for the first time since the trial began, fear touched Kong Min-jae's expression. Not fear of prison. Not fear of conviction. Fear that Daniel Brooks may have been right about him all along. The courtroom recess arrived 30 minutes later, but almost nobody left their seats. Reporters remained clustered near the front rows whispering urgently to producers through headsets while legal assistants rushed between tables carrying folders thick with documents no one seemed interested in anymore. Outside, the storm over Seoul darkened the sky until the courthouse windows reflected the room back at itself like mirrors. And in the middle of it all sat Hannah Brooks quietly coloring on the back of a legal notepad someone had given her. The image she drew looked simple at first glance. A little house. Rain clouds. A man holding an umbrella over a child. Kong Min-jae noticed it immediately. He watched her small hand move carefully across the paper while Eleanor Peterson spoke softly with one of the court officers nearby. For a moment, the courtroom almost forgot who he was supposed to be. "You draw like your father," Min-jae said quietly. Hannah looked up in surprise. "You remember that?" He nodded once. Daniel could never draw straight lines either. The child smiled faintly for the first time all day, and the expression hit Min-jae harder than any accusation ever had. It reminded him painfully of another smile from another life, long before money and power had replaced every decent thing inside him. Hannah carefully held up the drawing toward him. "This is Daddy," she explained. "And this is me." Min-jae studied the picture silently. "Who is holding the umbrella?" Hannah hesitated before answering. "I did not know yet." The room seemed to grow quieter around them. Even people pretending not to listen had stopped moving entirely. Eleanor turned slowly after hearing the exchange, uncertainty crossing her tired face. "Hannah," she said gently, "maybe we should give Mr. Kong some space." But Hannah remained where she was. "Daddy said lonely people need company too." Min-jae lowered his eyes briefly after hearing that. Somewhere deep beneath the calm mask he had worn for decades, the sentence landed with devastating precision. Because loneliness was the one accusation he could never deny. Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo entered the courtroom again carrying a fresh stack of files beneath his arm. The moment he saw Min-jae speaking calmly with the child, irritation hardened visibly across his expression. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath before approaching the prosecution table. He immediately addressed Judge Han the moment proceedings resumed. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests that the child be removed from the courtroom moving forward." Hannah's smile disappeared instantly. Eleanor looked alarmed. "On what grounds?" Lee answered without hesitation. "Her presence is compromising the emotional neutrality of this trial." Judge Han adjusted his glasses slowly. "She has disrupted nothing." "With respect, Your Honor, this is no longer a courtroom. It is becoming a sympathy performance." Min-jae finally looked toward the prosecutor again. Calm returned to his face instantly, but now there was disappointment in it too. "You keep using that word," he said quietly. "Sympathy." Lee crossed his arms. "Because that is exactly what you are trying to create." Hannah frowned in confusion before speaking softly from her chair. "What is wrong with sympathy?" Nobody answered her right away. The silence stretched so long it became painful. Finally, Hannah looked around the courtroom carefully at all the adults in expensive suits arguing over rules and procedures while rain pressed softly against the courthouse glass. Then she asked the question that shattered whatever emotional distance remained inside the room. "If nobody feels bad when someone is hurting," she whispered, "then how does anything ever get better?" The entire courtroom went silent again. Completely silent. A juror lowered his head. One reporter slowly removed her earpiece. Even Judge Han stopped moving his pen across the bench. And for the first time since this trial began, Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo looked less certain of his own position than the little girl sitting across from him with crayons in her lap. After Hannah's question, the courtroom never fully recovered its balance. People shifted in their seats differently now, quieter, more uncertain of what side they were even standing on anymore. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper against the courthouse windows, and the gray afternoon light spilling across the room made everything look colder than before. Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo stood rigidly beside his table, jaw tight with frustration as he flipped through documents searching desperately for something solid enough to regain control. Facts. Numbers. Evidence. Things that did not cry or ask innocent questions about sympathy. "The prosecution calls its next witness," he announced firmly. A side door opened, and a middle-aged man in a dark navy suit entered slowly under escort. His name was Park Dae-hyun, a former financial consultant connected to several companies under federal investigation. Reporters immediately straightened in their seats. This was the witness the media had spent weeks discussing, the man expected to finally tie Kong Min-jae directly to the criminal network prosecutors claimed he controlled. Park adjusted his tie nervously before sitting down at the witness stand. Even from across the room, his discomfort was obvious. His fingers trembled slightly against the wooden armrest while court staff prepared the microphone. Prosecutor Lee approached carefully. "Mr. Park, did you previously conduct financial operations connected to the defendants' organization?" "Yes," Park answered quietly. "And during that time, did you witness illegal activities ordered directly by Kong Min-jae?" Park hesitated. "Just for a second. But in a courtroom, seconds mattered." "I witnessed transactions," he finally replied. Lee pressed forward quickly. "Were those transactions connected to intimidation and corruption?" Before Park could answer, Min-jae suddenly lifted his eyes toward him. No threat. No anger. Just a long, unreadable look. Park's voice faltered immediately. He swallowed hard. "I do not know everything." Frustration flashed across Prosecutor Lee's face. "You testified differently during preliminary interviews." Park loosened his collar slightly. Sweat had begun gathering along his forehead despite the cold room. "Things are more complicated than that." Hannah watched the exchange carefully from her chair beside Eleanor Peterson. She leaned closer and whispered softly, "Why does he look scared?" Eleanor did not answer. Because she saw it too. Not fear of Min-jae. Fear of lying. Prosecutor Lee sensed the shift immediately and moved closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Park, did the defendant ever order harm against Daniel Brooks?" The courtroom froze again. Park looked toward Min-jae instinctively before lowering his eyes. No, the answer hit the room like thunder. Lee stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "He never ordered anything against Daniel Brooks." The prosecutor's voice sharpened instantly. "But you previously stated Mr. Brooks became a threat to the organization." "To other people," Park corrected quietly. "Not to Mr. Kong." Complete silence followed. Min-jae closed his eyes briefly as though hearing something painful finally spoken aloud after years buried beneath lies. Prosecutor Lee stepped back slowly. "Are you changing your testimony under oath?" Park looked exhausted suddenly, like a man carrying too much guilt for too long. "I am correcting it." Hannah looked toward Min-jae with wide confused eyes. "Daddy was helping you," she whispered. Min-jae opened his eyes again and stared at the polished wood table before answering. "Your father was trying to stop something terrible." "Did he trust you?" The question lingered in the air between them. Long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Finally, Min-jae looked directly at the child. "More than he should have." Hannah nodded slowly as if piecing together a puzzle too large for someone her age to fully understand. Then she asked the one thing nobody in that courtroom was prepared to hear. "If my daddy trusted you," she whispered softly, "why did nobody protect him?" And this time, Kong Min-jae had no answer at all. Hannah's question remained suspended over the courtroom long after the sound of her voice disappeared. Nobody interrupted the silence this time. Not the prosecutor. Not the reporters. Not even Judge Han. Because there are moments when truth enters a room so quietly that everyone recognizes it at once but nobody knows what to do next. Kong Min-jae sat motionless beneath the cold fluorescent lights while rain traced slow paths down the courthouse windows behind him. The silver handcuffs around his wrists suddenly looked less like punishment and more like confession. Across from him, Hannah Brooks waited patiently for an answer only a child would still believe adults were brave enough to give. "If my daddy trusted you," she had asked softly, "why did nobody protect him?" Min-jae lowered his eyes toward the folded note resting beside his hands. "Please protect Hannah." The paper looked worn now from how tightly he had been holding it all afternoon. For years he had survived by never allowing regret to settle inside him for too long. Regret weakened people. Regret made men hesitate. But Daniel Brooks had always understood something about him others never did. Beneath the power. Beneath the fear. Beneath the carefully controlled silence. Kang Min-jae still carried the soul of a man who once wanted to become someone decent. And that was the part Daniel trusted. Slowly, Min-jae stood up. Chairs shifted softly across the courtroom as dozens of people straightened in surprise. Prosecutor Lee immediately rose to object, but Judge Han lifted a hand without taking his eyes off the defendant. Let him speak. The courtroom fell still again. Min-jae looked toward Hannah first before speaking to anyone else. Your father came to me 3 years ago, he said quietly. Not as an investigator. As a father. Hannah listened carefully, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. He told me there were people inside my organization planning something dangerous. He wanted names. Financial records. Routes. He believed if enough truth reached the right people, innocent families would stop suffering. Prosecutor Lee stared in disbelief. Reporters wrote furiously across notepads while cameras zoomed closer. Min-jae continued anyway. I should have refused him. His voice remained calm, but the exhaustion inside it was impossible to hide now. Instead, I helped him quietly for nearly a year. A ripple spread through the gallery. Eleanor Peterson covered her mouth softly with one hand. Why? Judge Han asked carefully. Min-jae looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering. Because Daniel Brooks still believed the world could become better. And after knowing him, he paused briefly. I wanted to believe it too. The silence that followed felt unbearably human. No headlines. No courtroom strategy. Just a tired man admitting something honest for the first time in years. Hannah tilted her head slightly. Then what happened? Min-jae closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them again, the coldness people feared was gone completely. I was too late. Hannah's face fell quietly. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the small sadness of a child learning adults fail each other more often than children imagine. Min-jae looked directly at her now. Your father saved lives, Hannah. More than anyone in this courtroom will ever know. But nobody saved him, she whispered. Min-jae's jaw tightened painfully. Then finally, in front of federal prosecutors, cameras, jurors, and a nation watching live television, Kang Min-jae bowed his head to a little girl and answered with the one thing powerful men almost never say out loud. No, he said softly. And that failure belongs to me. No one spoke after Kang Min-jae admitted the failure belonged to him. The courtroom remained suspended inside a silence so complete that even the rain outside sounded distant now, softened into a faint whisper against the glass high above the jury box. Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo slowly lowered the folder in his hands. For the first time since the trial began, he looked less like a man arguing a case and more like someone uncertain whether he still understood it. Hannah Brooks sat quietly in her chair, staring at Min-jae with the same solemn expression children wear when they realize adults cannot fix the things they promise to protect. Eleanor Peterson brushed tears carefully from beneath her eyes while pretending to adjust her glasses. Around the room, reporters who had arrived expecting headlines about corruption and organized crime now struggled to process the strange humanity unfolding before them. Judge Han leaned forward slightly. Defendant, he said carefully, are you stating under oath that Daniel Brooks cooperated with you voluntarily in order to expose criminal activity beyond your direct control? Min-jae nodded once. Yes. And why has this never been disclosed before? A faint smile touched Min-jae's face then, but it carried no warmth. Only exhaustion. Because Daniel believed some people inside the system were compromised. A ripple moved instantly through the courtroom. Prosecutor Lee straightened sharply. That accusation is entirely unsupported. I know, Min-jae answered calmly. Which is why Daniel kept records. The room froze again. Hannah blinked in confusion. Records? Min-jae looked toward her gently now, almost like he was speaking to someone far more fragile than himself. Your father trusted the truth enough to leave proof behind. Eleanor stared at him carefully. What kind of proof? Min-jae slowly reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket while federal officers instinctively tensed beside him. But all he removed was a small silver key attached to a faded blue keychain shaped like a paper crane. Hannah gasped softly the moment she saw it. Daddy had one just like that. Min-jae nodded faintly. They were connected. Judge Han narrowed his eyes. Connected to what? Min-jae held the key carefully between restrained fingers. A safety deposit box in Portland, Oregon. The courtroom erupted into whispers immediately. Prosecutor Lee stepped forward. Your Honor, we request immediate verification of this claim. But Judge Han never looked away from Min-jae. What is inside the box? Another pause. Long enough for cameras to zoom closer. Long enough for jurors to stop breathing. Everything Daniel collected, Min-jae answered quietly. Financial records. Internal communications. Names. Prosecutor Lee's face lost color almost instantly. Hannah looked from one adult to another, trying to understand why everyone suddenly appeared frightened. Will it help find out what happened to Daddy? She asked softly. Min-jae's expression tightened again. Then slowly, he nodded. Yes. Hannah lowered her eyes toward her backpack before speaking again in the smallest voice yet. Then maybe he did not disappear for nothing. Several people in the courtroom openly wiped tears away after hearing that. Even Judge Han removed his glasses briefly before clearing his throat. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city while courthouse lights reflected against rain-covered streets below. Min-jae looked toward Hannah one more time before speaking words nobody expected from the most feared man in Korea. Your father once told me something, he said quietly. He said the world changes slowly, usually because ordinary people choose kindness when they have every reason not to. Hannah listened carefully. Was he right? Min-jae stared at the child for a long moment. Then, surrounded by prosecutors, cameras, guards, and the shattered remains of the life he built through fear, Min-jae finally answered with complete honesty. I think he was trying to save me too. By the time the hearing finally adjourned for the evening, the storm outside had passed. Rainwater still shimmered across the courthouse steps beneath the glow of streetlights, but the thunder was gone now, leaving the city wrapped in an almost fragile quiet. Inside courtroom 7, nobody seemed eager to leave. Jurors sat silently gathering their belongings. Reporters spoke in hushed voices instead of the frantic excitement they carried earlier that morning. Even Prosecutor Lee Sun-woo looked drained, standing near the prosecution table with loosened shoulders as though the weight of the day had settled onto him too. Because somewhere between legal arguments and witness testimony, the trial had transformed into something none of them expected. It had become about grief. About failure. About whether broken men deserved the chance to become honest before it was too late. Min-jae remained seated while federal officers prepared to escort him out. The silver key with the blue paper crane now rested carefully beside Judge Han's bench, already marked for emergency retrieval by federal investigators in Oregon. Whatever waited inside Daniel Brooks's safety deposit box would change lives. Perhaps governments. Perhaps entire careers. But at that moment, none of it seemed more important than the little girl quietly stuffing crayons back into her faded backpack near the front row. Hannah looked smaller somehow now that the day was ending. Tired. Her curls slightly messy from hours spent inside the cold courtroom. Eleanor Peterson helped button the child's oversized coat while speaking softly about dinner plans and the long drive back to the foster center. Then Hannah looked toward Min-jae one last time. Are they taking you away now? She asked quietly. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to interrupt. Min-jae stood slowly from his chair. Even exhausted, he carried the same calm presence that once terrified entire rooms. But Hannah no longer looked at him with fear. Only sadness. Yes, he answered gently. Hannah nodded as though she expected that answer already. Then she reached into her backpack and carefully pulled out the drawing she had made earlier. The little house. The rain clouds. The man holding an umbrella over a child. She walked across the courtroom and held it out toward him with both hands. "You can keep it," she whispered. Min-jae stared at the paper for several seconds before taking it carefully between restrained fingers. The drawing trembled slightly in his hands. Not because of the paper. Because of him. "Why would you give me this?" he asked softly. Hannah shrugged in the simple way children do when kindness feels obvious to them. "Because lonely people need company too." One of the federal officers quietly looked away after hearing that. Eleanor covered her mouth again, tears shining openly now. Min-jae lowered his eyes to the drawing before speaking in a voice rougher than anyone had heard all day. "Your father was right about you." Hannah tilted her head slightly. "About what?" A long silence followed. Then Kong Min-jae answered with complete honesty. "You make people want to become better." The child smiled softly. Small. Gentle. Real. And somehow that expression carried more power than every courtroom speech spoken that day. As officers finally guided Min-jae toward the side exit, he paused once near the doorway and looked back at Hannah standing beneath the courthouse lights with her backpack hanging crookedly from one shoulder. For years people had called him a monster, a ghost, a man too far gone to save. Yet in the end, the person who reached him was not a judge or a politician or a prosecutor. It was a little girl carrying crayons, grief, and the last kindness her father left behind. And that day, inside a silent courtroom washed clean by rain, the world remembered what dignity looks like. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share the video so more people can discover stories about kindness, justice, and the humanity we sometimes forget still exists.